All right, happy Tuesday, everyone. Welcome back to the dead of winter in Minnesota. Excited to hear thoughts. I will stop sharing my screen for a sec. How many of you had a chance to watch The Way We Think About Charity is Dead Wrong TED Talk? Have any of you seen that prior to this class? No, fairly new. I will say that presentation within the social enterprise, particularly nonprofit space, stirred a lot of energy when it came out. There's a lot of dialogue around what nonprofit leaders make, about where nonprofit leaders are spending money, specifically for growing organizations. We're going to talk today about some of the history of social entrepreneurship and where we've come from, talk briefly about trends of where we're going. But I think that video really lays it up well. Would be curious from what you watched, if you had any kind of observations or thoughts, reflections from that.
I don't know if any of you had Cabo Yang for, I don't remember, management. I don't remember what the class was, but we had something very similar we watched. It was a TED Talk with this woman just talking about how even just it was more like just nonprofits in general than charity, but just how we think about their overhead and administrative expenses in the wrong way. And I thought it was pretty similar in general.
I'm actually in that class right now, and we watched it last night. So perfect timing. But yeah, the one we watched in this, I think it's, I can't remember what the title of the class is, but it focuses a little more on kind of rewriting the scope of like the nonprofit sector in general, down to the core of like renaming what we even call the sector. This one was a little more on the conceptual level, and I think he did like an absolute fantastic job of not only defining my preconceived notions of the nonprofit sector that are commonly shared by a lot of people, telling me why they are wrong, and then presenting a new option on a new way to think about it. So yeah, I really loved it, and I thought he really killed the presentation and gave a very thorough understanding on new ways to think about things.
Absolutely. I love, I think really for me, what helps is the examples he gives. It comes to life when you talk about you can make, X millions of dollars to be on the cover of Wired magazine. But if you want to do something to change the world, we get upset if you're making a few $100,000. And then specifically to me, another one that hits home is the bake sale analogy. I know that's something we feel, I would say at Wallen. I would be curious for Greg's thoughts as well at Wilderness Inquiry, is when we come up with potential new ideas specifically around fundraising, there's a lot of pushback from our own board on saying, we really shouldn't be spending too much money on this. It feels off scope. And that's great if you want to do it. But to the analogy of the bake sale, make sure you're not spending very much money on fundraising activities.
Yeah, I've found it with our board at Wilderness Inquiry over 40 years. I mean, I had my many moments with them, and it caused me to evolve one of my truisms about being an executive director of a socially innovative nonprofit, that you have to have the hide of a rhinoceros and the emotional memory of a gnat, so that you don't take any of this stuff too personally, and you try to realize where they're coming from and keep moving on. Because boards are risk averse, and they, most people don't join a nonprofit board where they don't get paid anything, with the prospect of looking like a failure or having it, them look bad. And so there's just, I think the whole genre is kind of stacked up to try to shy away from risk and, stay in the narrow path of, that everybody thinks is right. And that's, that's just kind of built into the way that governance method works. But I'd say that I thought when I saw the Dan Pallotta TED Talk, I thought that was right on. And I can't tell you how many times, the nonprofit compensation thing came up, how many times the overhead issue comes up. And, by the way, I would just tell you that, nonprofits get ranked on that by the Charities Review Council and other groups, and almost all of them game it. I mean, it's, how are you defining a management and general cost or a fundraising cost? Well, if you have some educational fact in your fundraising materials, you can call it education. So it's like, you see these groups, and I don't mean to sound cynical, but you see these groups that have like 7% fundraising costs or 10% management costs. And, it's just all in how they're defining it, and the ability to define it however you want. You have a lot of latitude as a nonprofit to do that. So the focus on it is all wrong, I think. And hopefully we can get to a point in the nonprofit sector where we evolve beyond that and start to look at it more from an impact point of view than, whether your overhead's too high.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. And so it's something, as you're working with organizations, if you feel like you're finding that hard spot that you're pushing up an organization that they're struggling with, be bringing that back to our class, because I think there's a lot of different examples that exist out there. One more that I would share with Wallen specifically is when we apply for grants or funding from community foundations, we generally get a lot of pushback that we have a lot of reserve dollars that we already are sitting on, essentially. And, why do we need more money if we already have plenty of money? But it's only once you start to understand the mission of what Wallen Education Partners is doing. It's providing scholarships and wraparound services. So if we're supporting 100 students with scholarships, we're supporting them through the duration of their time in college, which means I'm only unlocking a quarter of those funds your freshman year. You're going to need them, though, your sophomore, your junior, your senior year. And so it's just that continuing nuance and education for the donor, where we get asked questions off the cuff without, I would say, a deeper level understanding of what the organizations are doing, and to Greg's point, really how we're creating impact. So I think we started this with a little bit of a rant, but it's a great video and something that we're going to talk a lot more about as we go on with the semester. So each of you had a chance to meet your clients, to really talk about what research is going to look like. I want to make sure, we'll have time at the end to debrief that if you have questions specifically as it relates to the upcoming assignments we have. But today, the majority of time, we're going to be talking about the history of social entrepreneurship. Where have we come from? Greg's going to share about that. And then we also have 3 students that are going to be sharing out their individual research presentations. Before we get started on any of that, are there any announcements? All right. Well, I believe we have more Morgan, Ian, and Quincy sharing today. Does anyone want to go first?
I can go first.
Sounds good. Thank you.
All right, can you guys see that?
Perfect.
Awesome. So today I'm really excited to talk to you guys about Alight. It's an organization that's really near and dear to my heart, so hopefully you guys can learn a lot about them through my presentation. So Alight was formerly known as the American Refugee Committee, or ARC, and it's an international non-governmental organization, actually headquartered right here in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Alight has a really broad mission to exist to inspire and unleash the abundance in every person. But what this kind of looks like in action is Alight providing healthcare, clean water, shelter, protection, and economic opportunities to more than 3.5 million people in 17 different countries. So before 2019, Alight was known as the American Refugee Committee because of its commitment to serving refugees around the world. In 2019, however, the organization actually decided to drop the refugee label and became Alight after recognizing its vision was so much more than just supporting individuals during what they would describe that one dark moment in their lives where they were labeled as refugees. So rather, Alight is now committed to serving all those displaced and marginalized. Currently, this is done through working with underserved communities across Africa, Asia, and the Americas in 8 different sectors. So they have education, health, WASH, which is water and sanitation hygiene, shelter, social enterprise, camp management protection, and emergency response. A really cool, recent example of the work Alight does was actually their global In Our Hands campaign, where they raised awareness about COVID-19 in remote and underserved regions of the world. So during the campaign, and actually still today, Alight is providing resources for communities to practice good hygiene practices, but also learn safety precautions to protect themselves and prevent the spread of the pandemic in areas where often the spread would not be able to be controlled if a large outbreak did occur. Alight sustains itself solely on grants and contributions, or otherwise classified as individual donations. So according to its 2020 financial statements, up on the screen you can see 2019, but a little bit more up to date. For 2020, Alight received most of its support through US government and United Nations grants, so about 29.8 and 16.2 million respectively. In addition to its large reliance on grants, Alight also received 11.7 million in contributions, which is also individual donations in 2020. So unlike many other social enterprises, Alight actually does not bring in any earned income and is thus dependent on solely outside sources of funding, which I think is really interesting, especially for an organization this large, that they're offering all of their services free of cost to any of their beneficiaries, and they're really not profiting off any of it, which I'll kind of bring up again in a little bit. But this can be a pretty difficult revenue strategy to sustain. However, to date, Alight has been extremely successful in supporting all of its initiatives financially. So I have personally worked with Alight's offices in Somalia, Kenya, and Minneapolis to implement my own initiative looking at improving young adult livelihoods. And we're doing this by creating economic opportunities, improving access to education, and then facilitating community connections. So one thing that's kind of interesting about that project is because they don't bring in any earned income, we've had to fully fund that initiative through grants and donations, which is different than I think a lot of partnerships with a different social enterprise would have been. Often that organization would have kind of put up the money in order to do the initiative for it. But through my involvement with the organization, I've had the opportunity to work with employees all across the organization, from the education and youth engagement coordinator in Somalia, all the way to the global projects and outreach lead in Kenya. So through these conversations, I've really seen a common theme. All of Alight's employees are really passionate about giving back to the underserved and really strongly believe in the work they're doing and supporting. In some of their own words, Alight gives people back their joy and enthusiasm for life. And one of my coworkers just last week told me that he wishes he could wake up every morning and there was more hours in the day so he could continue using Alight's platform to reach more people. So I think that's just a good testament and a good way to leave it off. Be happy to answer any questions you all have.
Great work, Morgan, very thorough, thank you. And also I think it is interesting as you talk about the fact that, similar to what we talked about at the beginning, is their orientation or ability to focus on innovation, new programming, when they are reliant on funding, grants. And I think your ability to see that firsthand is very interesting. All right, I want to make sure we are cruising through. Quincy or Ian, who would like to go next?
I'll go next.
Thanks.
All right, I didn't really prepare a visual though, so I don't know if that was necessary.
Certainly not necessary. The key is that each of you have done research and you're sharing out kind of what those key highlights have been. Thank you.
Absolutely. So I'm studying People Serving People. It is the largest and most comprehensive emergency shelter for families experiencing homelessness in Minnesota. The mission behind the organization is "We exist to see families thrive." They also shared a vision on their website. It's healed families, transformed communities. The audience, the People Serving People serves, is, well, in 2019, roughly 2,600 individuals experiencing homelessness, and the average age of that was 16 years old. The financial structure of the organization, it's mostly sustained through governmental contracts and grants that accounted for roughly half of its revenue in 2019. The second largest source of funds was from corporate contracts and grants, And being a 501c3 nonprofit, it did just get a lot of individual donations from other people. So I chose to study this organization because, well, I've done some volunteering with them prior to COVID, and I really like what they're doing. Homelessness is obviously just something that I'm interested in personally, but the organization is quite interesting. It was founded in 1982. It has like a whole bunch of different programs within its downtown Minneapolis headquarters, such as like a child care program. It's got kind of like rehabilitation services for like struggling with drug abuse, people such as that. It's also got like work people trying to enter people back into the workforce. It's got programs for that. And one spot that I want to see the organization improve in is like adding a gym to the facilities so that people can, I guess, exercise or just have something to do while they're spending some time at the shelter. But yeah, and then so I'm doing a interview with a former member of People Serving People today, actually, after class. So unfortunately, I don't have anything to share quite yet, but I'm sure that conversation will hold a lot of cool stuff. So yeah, that's all I've got. Thank you guys for listening.
Are there any questions from the class? I think, Ian, it's particularly intriguing because you're spotlighting an organization in an area that you have interest in going into, and using those insights to talk about how can they grow, do better, be more efficient. And I love the idea of both a gym from like a productivity standpoint, but also just a community center, I think is another important thing and more prevalent and plausible post-COVID.
Yeah, absolutely. Having like a basketball court there would be awesome because like there's kind of a community around a basketball court, speaking from experience. So yeah.
And next we have Quincy presenting.
Sounds good. I'll share my screen here. So I just have one slide. I chose Events by Lady K, and Events by Lady K is a public benefit corporation based in Minneapolis that plans events focused on accessibility and inclusivity. I had the opportunity to work with Events by Lady K last semester for a group project. And so I've worked both with Ryan, who is the president and founder of Events by Lady K, as well as Laura, who is the chief of operations and client relations. So they were founded in 2012. And then Brian went full-time with the venture in 2013. So they've been in existence for 7 years now, or 8, I guess it's 2021. So their mission I have here on the left side is to partner with mission-driven clients to create extraordinary mission-centered events where every attendee feels welcomed, celebrated, and included. Their clients range from large organizations to individuals. Many of the large organizations are foundations or large nonprofits, corporations, universities. And individuals are usually folks who work at a nonprofit organization who might not have the resources to have a whole event planned by Events by Lady K, but rather just wants one of their team members to get trained on Events by Lady K style of planning and hosting events. And so some of their loyal and consistent clients include the Bush Foundation, Headwaters Foundation, funders for LGBTQ issues, and the University of Minnesota. And so for their revenue is all generated through services that they provide. And so they do event planning services. This ranges from a full-scale execution of an event, so from like idea generation until after the event, but they also just do like day of logistics support. And they additionally provide mentoring and coaching around inclusivity and accessibility. So again, all of their services focus on inclusion and accessibility. And I've been to a few of like events that they've hosted, and I've always thought they're really incredible how they center accessibility first rather than asking it in a question in the form when you register. So they really start with inclusion, and it really makes their events awesome. Any questions?
I have one, Quincy. What event did you go to? What was the setup of it?
Yeah, sorry, I'm trying to like share my screen simultaneously here. This summer at my job, they did like a Feed the Spark event partnered with the Bush Foundation. And so they went over like how to have some engaging Zoom meetings, and they did a little bio, and they actually did like the Carlson Centennial last year at the US Bank Stadium. I didn't go to that, but maybe some of you did. And so they hosted that event and planned it.
So cool. Thanks.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Would be curious as well, where do you see the biggest opportunity or growth for them? I mean, you talked about they're working with organizations that are essentially looking to lead, be more intentional, and be mission driven. Would be curious as they grow, what opportunity looks like.
Yeah, so the project I worked on with them last semester, we actually explored them doing an online course with COVID and just talking about how can they train other people to put on this like events like this and just focus on inclusion and accessibility. And so we actually explored that and decided that it wasn't the right opportunity at the time, just because there's lots of free like Coursera similar courses right now, but I would like to see how they can expand virtually and kind of make events inclusive, even in like a Zoom space and other things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, thank you each for all three of you presenting. Excited to continue to do this. I think it's great insight into locally as organizations, are available in our community. And then also as we have more weeks, we'll start to talk about what trends and themes we're seeing, whether it's from revenue generation, from how organizations are positioning themselves, their value proposition to both their constituents, but then the community at large. And then obviously it's about increasing visibility. That's something that we heard in the Dan Pallotta video as well. And so we'll talk about that through the semester. With that, I'm excited to hand it over to Greg to give us a little more on the history of social entrepreneurship.
Well, thank you, Matt. Yeah, so in talking with Matt about the course, he asked to create this little module on the history of social entrepreneurship, which I'm happy to do and really excited to present to you and get feedback on from you. It's, doing research on the topic and, reading around and digging into it, it became evident to me that it's really, kind of an evolving, it's sort of an evolutionary thing. And if there's any takeaway that I want you to get from this is to realize that it's evolving as we speak. So let's see, Matt, what do I do? Press share screen here.
Yep.
Okay. And then.
And we've talked about this a little bit prior in this semester, but in terms of framing this topic up as well, Greg not only is bringing insights from, externally, what the social enterprise sector has looked like and how it's changed, but also personally, from his experience at your age, essentially starting an organization and living through simultaneously the changes. And we'll talk actually about legal, like 501c3 tax status changes as he was just creating his organization.
Yeah, thanks, Matt. It's kind of funny because I think about that when I was 21, 22 years old and didn't have a clue about, social enterprise or nonprofits or anything, and heard of these things called foundations that actually gave people money. And I remember getting our first grant from the Bayport Foundation for $3,000 and dancing in the street. And yeah, it's weird to think that you actually have a place on a timeline like this. So with that, I wanted to, let's see here. Did you see the screen okay? Is that that's working for you? All right. So I came across this quote by, the playwright George Bernard Shaw. Actually, it was interesting. The he to we organization that we're trying to change the language. Of course, this was the reasonable man adapts to the world and the unreasonable man persists. So it was very much the he language of its day. So I tried to modify that. And one of the questions that's interesting is, do you just modify a quote to update the language or not? I don't know if you've seen those kinds of things in your, what you come across, but I updated it. So it says, a reasonable person adapts to the world. The unreasonable person persists in trying to adapt the world to their views. Therefore, all progress must depend on the unreasonable person. So I thought that a fun little comment that we're going to come back to in the course of the presentation. So, we think of social entrepreneurism as being a relatively recent phenomena, but I actually don't think so. I mean, giving back has been around for a long time. If you're familiar with the evolutionary biologist E.O. Wilson, the whole idea of altruism, how did that evolve? And it's kind of been with our species for forever. I mean, whatever the motivation is another discussion. But altruism's been around. And as I got digging into the whole idea of social entrepreneurism, they talk about a period of time from the 1800s to 1920 for the progressive era in the United States. And you think about it, increased social activism and political reform, especially around like child labor laws, suffrage for women, equal rights for women, prohibition, all kind of tied to, by the way, one of the underlying themes here is, I would say, increased prosperity and wealth of the country. Because I think from the 1800s to 1920, America became more wealthy. And, so I want to paint that as kind of the context of, things really evolving over time. And it was, some say that it was Andrew Carnegie, the great, industrialist, who wrote this book, The Gospel of Wealth. And he promoted the idea of owing a duty to society rather than just to your family. And so he is one of the early pioneers in philanthropy, saying that, you should give to the community. Prior to that, or mostly prior to that, a lot of rich people, they just gave to their family, passed down wealth through the generations. They never thought of a community giving effort. Now, he today would be considered like the epitome of a great white savior. I mean, Andrew Carnegie would be, because he didn't think that the masses could figure out what to do with wealth. It had to be all rich people giving it away and figuring out what to do with it. But if you think of this as a continuum moving along, it was still a big shift for the world to start giving to others' community. So then there was this this Review Act of 1917, Revenue Act, I'm sorry, which created the individual income tax deduction for charitable donations, which, was a big move. And you think of that context, that was during World War I. And that was, when the flu pandemic was around. So just trying to think of these things in their context. And then the next one, these are legal laws that were passed. I mean, the Tax Reform Act of 1969 actually created 501c3 status, which seems strange to me because I was alive then. And, you think of when did nonprofits actually begin? Well, they began a lot earlier than this, as we'll get into it, but the 501c3 status was really just in 1969. So, one of the earlier nonprofits was the YMCA. And I think that, I just wanted to share this slide because you think of the Y as being, it's considered one of the most recognizable brands in the world, if not the most recognizable brand. But it was started by this guy, George Williams, in 1844, who was really an early social entrepreneur. And, London at the time was pretty bleak, with tenement houses, a lot of pollution. Oops, sorry about that. And he was just they describe him, a farmer turned department store worker. And he got 11 friends to create the first Young Men's Christian Association, where they studied the Bible and did things. But they also, what do they say here? They met social needs in the community and were open to crossing the rigid line separating English social classes at the time. So you think about the origin of a YMCA back there in England, very humble. This guy just kind of gathering with friends in the alley, and look what it grew into today. And its big, migration across the sea was this Boston sea captain who saw it and created it in Boston at the Old South Church in 1851. The Y, by the way, today is struggling mightily with the pandemic because most of its earned revenues are coming from fitness centers. So that's another conversation. But here's just another way of saying this. This is kind of a timeline. You know, in the early 1900s here, back in, you know, business and philanthropy were viewed as two separate things. They weren't merged. They were, you know, philanthropy was giving away the money that you earned if you became wealthy. And then in the 70s, you know, social entrepreneurship started to emerge or be recognized, you know, as a managerial skill, you know, that supplemented entrepreneurial and business activities. In the 80s, you know, it started to become associated with business practices. And it was in the 80s that Ashoka was formed. I guess I go into that in a minute. In the 90s, you know, it was viewed as an act to create social wealth by nonprofit organizations. How do nonprofits generate wealth? And, you know, it just kept evolving so that, you know, by 2010, you know, it was looked at as a entrepreneurial field with links to various disciplines. So that's, you know, this timeline is just kind of and it was pretty recent to me, 2010, it was only 10 years ago. I mean, that's nothing. So there's another way of kind of looking at that. And I think a more simple way, you know, and I don't mean, I mean, this is a business school. So I think of like, I kind of boil it down to revenue generation. So you talk about pure charity. So Ian, you were talking about people serving people is they only have donations, correct? And the same with Alight. I mean, it's all donations. It's not earned revenue per se. So the pure charity model has been around for, at least in the Western world. I'm sure that in China and India and other places, parts of the world, it's been around for a long time, but you know, for about 1,000 years. Then 50 years ago, we started the hybrid nonprofit, where it's donations plus earned revenue. And I realized that I was a part of that movement because early on in Wilderness Inquiry, we evolved. We started off as pure donations, but then we started evolving trip fees and charging people for trips, because what we found was when we gave away trips for free, nobody showed up. I mean, a lot of people would cancel. So we started charging $25, you know, to go on a trip to the Bounty Waters. And when people actually plunked their money down, they started going, which was really an interesting discovery. And then now the idea of the public benefit corporation started about, you know, 10, 11 years ago. And that's an actual classification of a for-profit corporation. So, you know, I'm a big believer in earned revenue for nonprofits and controlling their own destiny. And, you know, I think the trend is fabulous, but there are drawbacks to it, and there is pushback to it. And, you know, one of them is that the claims of unfair competition by for-profit companies. And, you know, if you've been around, like the YMCA, you know, is in competition with, you know, Lifetime Fitness, Snap Fitness, Anytime Fitness. And, you know, they don't like it because they view the Y through having tax exemptions and not having to pay property taxes and other things are direct competitors with them. So a lot of times as you start a nonprofit venture, you know, don't necessarily expect the for-profit community to embrace that venture, because they may look at you as, you know, unfair competition. And with Wilderness Inquiry, us doing canoe trips in the Bounty Waters, you know, for groups of people with disabilities and others, a lot of the for-profit outfitters considered us competition. So it's interesting. And, you know, like I say, you know, nonprofits have many advantages. You know, they don't pay taxes. So municipalities, by the way, kind of hate that. So we were are exempt from property taxes in the city of Minneapolis, but the cities come after Wilderness, you know, come after us like 3 or 4 times to try to justify that, wanting us to, you know, they want us to pay property taxes, which would be, you know, an additional $40,000, $50,000, $60,000 budgetary expense. So there's, you know, to the question of overhead that Dan Pallotta was talking about, you know, nonprofits can be criticized for having overhead, but they also have other advantages that the for-profit world and others, you know, when they're in the money-making schemes, you know, don't like. So I just wanted to highlight that, and, you know, maybe we can come back to, you know, you can think of other drawbacks that nonprofits would have.
I think the other thing I would emphasize is we're at a really unique moment in history. When you talk about the fact that nonprofits are the only entities that can generate funds through donations, this past year more than ever, we saw individuals giving dollars, whether it was a donation or essentially purchasing gift cards, you know, the promise of future payment for restaurants and organizations, you know, that we want to support in our community that are for-profit entities. And so I think we're going to continue to see this blurring of organizations that we want to support broadly, regardless of their tax status. And so we'll talk more about that in a moment, but I want to make sure, Greg, you can continue on.
Yeah, and thanks, Matt. And I agree with you. You know, when we went out to eat to support local businesses, and, you know, you hear support local business, and that's, you know, really important. So that's a form of philanthropy, really, even though it's for-profit businesses. So I wanted to make a point. In the literature, they talked about the difference between social entrepreneurship versus entrepreneurship. And I think it's really important for us to think about this for a second, because that first bullet point there of this French economist, Jean-Baptiste Say, you know, says an entrepreneur is somebody who shifts economic resources out of an area of lower and into an area of higher productivity and greater yield. So basically, they can take dirt and spin it into gold, you know, and how do you create value where others don't see value? I mean, that's what an entrepreneur does. But social entrepreneurs, you know, seek to transform societies, you know, and rather than simply increasing their profit margins. And, you know, for the evolution of someone to become a social entrepreneur, to do that, it's kind of an interesting progression. And a lot of, and maybe this is because of Ashoka. How many of you have heard of Ashoka before? Have you heard of Ashoka? You know, kind of a nonprofit think tank, kind of supports social entrepreneurs and supports individuals.
I was going to say, do you want to give just a 30-second on Ashoka's, you know, where it started and where they are today? Because they are now one of the largest NGOs.
Yeah, I think that comes in the next slide. I'm going to do that. So I will get there in just a second, Matt. But I would just say that, you know, this marriage of transforming societies with entrepreneurial thinking is really kind of what the core of a social entrepreneur is. And it's not really a new concept. I mean, if you Google Florence Nightingale, for example, the mother of modern day nursing, you know, I mean, she's an example of a person who is pretty peculiar, really, but she also transformed the way nursing happened. And anyways, so to that, the piece of Ashoka is down here on the third part, and that's this guy, Bill Drayton, you know, founded it in 1980, and it supports social entrepreneurs based on 4 concepts of creativity, entrepreneurial quality, social impact of the idea, and ethical fiber. And they've evolved a whole body of work and supported a lot of people over the years. And it's been, you know, I think Ashoka can be credited for really bringing and highlighting the social entrepreneur, social enterprise sector, you know, in a big way. Kind of going backwards through these bullet points. I mean, there was this guy, Mohammed Yunus, who I think he was is Pakistani, and he founded the Grameen Bank and created the concept of microcredit, you know, for entrepreneurs in third world countries to get, you know, little micro grants that would help them create their businesses, which is now, you know, viewed as a kind of, I don't know if I'd say mainstream, but it's viewed as a very credible way of helping develop business in third world countries. But he just started it, you know, it took him years to get it going, and now it's a big deal. And going back up to the top here, you know, the social entrepreneur, I mean, when did the term, everybody's like trying to claim when did the term first come around? And it actually looks like it was in a book in 1953 by this guy, The Social Responsibilities of the Businessman. Back to the he to we language again. I ordered that book. It hasn't come yet, but I can't wait to read it to see how they started thinking in those terms. But my point is that, you know, for this evolution of social enterprise, it really requires 3 things. And one is there's a market disequilibrium here. And that could be exploitive labor, it could be climate change, it could be, you know, environment, it could be any number of things where the market is not taking into account, all of the inputs or outputs of goods and services. And you could say climate change, for years, and this is true with the environment in general, we've just dumped carbon dioxide into the atmosphere, not being aware of what the impact would be, thinking it was free, and not pricing that in the marketplace. So, the three elements are the market disequilibrium, and then there's the social entrepreneur who recognizes it and starts to see that market disequilibrium. And then the third piece is capital. They need money. And those three things are kind of essential to create the social enterprise. Now, I wanted to show you this slide, and I think we may come back to this later on and go into it more, because in this book, The Power of Unreasonable People, these authors argue that social entrepreneurs seek profit in social output where others would not expect profit, and therefore they are highly unreasonable. And these are the 10 points that they had in there. They want to change the system rather than adapt to it, to the George Bernard Shaw quote. They're insanely ambitious, big problems excite them, propelled by emotion and lead with their hearts. They think they know the future. They seek profit in unprofitable pursuits. They ignore evidence. Do any of you feel like you can relate to this? They try to measure the unmeasurable. Here was an interesting one. They are unqualified in their field of change. And, you could say that we helped revolutionize the way people with disabilities were treated in the community. And the whole Americans with Disabilities Act, and, being treated as patients or lesser than, or, people to be pitied, by bringing them to the wilderness and showing that wilderness is just, a place where they could go, help transform them into looking like, normal people, which was our whole gig. I would tell you, we were unqualified to lead that change, and it was probably good, because we never viewed, when we started Wilderness Inquiry, people with disabilities were viewed in the medical model. They were viewed as patients. And when we started it, we didn't have that model. We just viewed him, oh, there's a dude in a wheelchair. And, our only question was, can he paddle? And if he could, we put him in a canoe and we paddled. And so this thing that you're unqualified in your field of change is actually a really important piece, I think, to being a social entrepreneur. They refuse to be made into superheroes, and the last one here, their impatience can make them tough to work with. I think if you asked a lot of the people I've worked with over the years, they would say absolutely right on. You talk to my wife about that too. So these are 10 characteristics of, social entrepreneurs that make them kind of unreasonable. And like I say, we may come back to this, because I think you could think of yourself, do you fit in this profile or not? So what we wanted to do here was kind of break up the monotony of a long lecture and have you take a look at, get together in groups and come up with a couple reasons why you think this concept of social entrepreneurship has become, such a popular topic in business schools or in community. But it seems like most business schools now have, when I started at the Carlson School when did I start? In 86 or something like that. There was no nonprofit sector. There was no social entrepreneurs. St. Thomas was the nonprofit one. If you wanted to go learn the nonprofit world, you got your MBA at St. Thomas. I didn't want to do that, because I figured I already knew the nonprofit world. And Carlson was, mainly mid-level managers from Fortune 500 companies. Those are my classmates. And so we just want to take a little break here and go into a room and come up with reasons why you think it's become more popular. Is that okay? Matt, can you do that? Can you do the?
Yeah, absolutely. So we will open the room now, and we'll come back in about 5 or 10 minutes.
So one thing that we talked about in our group was that with the rise of social media and technological progress, social issues have a much higher level of visibility than they did back in the 80s. So this is leading more and more people to, it sparks emotions in them, and they care. They see these problems and want to do something about it. And through social entrepreneurship, that can be a very effective way to do something about a problem. So that's why I think in business school, it's become an actual like area of study because, well, yeah, it's a big problem. If anyone else in my group had wanted to add to that, please do.
Yeah, also another thing we talked about is humanity as a whole right now are kind of like on a higher level on the Maslow's chart. So we are not satisfied with just making more money because we're mostly, most people are fed, most people have a decent life. So we want to achieve something more.
Thank you. That's very well said. There's a great book called Factfulness. I would encourage everyone to check out, but I think you both are hitting on something, and Greg talked about it in the historical context as well. As societies essentially grow in wealth and this greater focus on both purpose, you know, and essentially having the financial capital to do something about societal issues and shortcomings, I think there is greater attention. And as Ian said, I think the fact that we have more visibility than ever on issues plaguing our own community, as well as, you know, internationally abroad, some of those collective issues. Okay, what about group 2?
I think I might have been group 2. I'm honestly not certain. But I can talk about what my group talked about. We covered a lot of different topics, I guess. And a big part of it was how Sage brought up a really good point that like social entrepreneurship has kind of come out of the model of capitalism. And I hope I'm like saying this correctly. So Sage, correct me if you want it said differently, but kind of how like nonprofits probably work better in a different like society because they would actually be incentivized, but they aren't incentivized since we are like always looking at capital in our capitalist society. And so how social entrepreneurship has kind of tried to like melt that and become a solution. So that was a big part of our conversation. And we talked a lot about how it specifically applied to Carlson and kind of the nonprofit major and how it's felt like a little bit like a way to cover like Carlson's butt in a way of being like, we say we're business as a force for good, but are we actually like speaking on that? And I'm sorry if I'm like, you know, kind of like going a little like intense on Carlson right now, but we were describing how the nonprofit major even just like it doesn't even like get the like popularity or like the talk as much as the other ones do, but that it's like a way to kind of try to achieve this business as a force for good, at least on a surface level. And any of my group members can add.
I think it's really well said. And that's one of the things I would emphasize is social entrepreneurship is just such a higher intentionality. I think about it as, you know, much more holistic. And then also with a focus on long-term orientation. You know, naturally, one of the shortcomings with capitalism is the fact that we are continually focused on profit generation today. Even things that generate profit in a long term are not worth the investment in a, you know, traditional equation. And so we'll talk more about that in a moment, but want to make sure our third group as well. Any other thoughts? I realize you are jumping from class to class with Zoom room to Zoom room. So if you don't know who was group 1, 2, or 3, not to worry. Greg, I will hand it back to you. Do we want to continue on then?
Sure. Yeah, we can wrap this up. But I think it's really interesting, the comments, you know, from the groups, and I agree with them all. And I think of, you know, especially like the social media or the dispersion of communications and information. And I will tell you a little story that I have. My grandfather was born in 1892 in southern Minnesota, and he lived in a little town called Adrian. And he said, and these are updated words, I would say, he said he saw his first car, it was a Stanley steamer, when he was like 9 years old. He saw his first airplane, you know, some biplane or something like that, when he was like 19 years old. So that would have been 1892, about 1919 or so. And he was in World War One. And then he said he saw his first person of color. He didn't term it that way, but he said he saw his first person of color when he was 33 years old. And, you know, you think about that in the context of, you know, life in Minnesota, rural Minnesota. And just, you know, I heard a statistic that said that my grandparents, so your great grandparents, I guess, students today with social media and everything else receive 1,000 times more information a day than they did, at least from external sources, you know, from your iPhone or whatever it is. And, you know, back then, I mean, they would listen to the wind and, you know, check to see how the birds were flying, or, you know, whatever it was. I mean, they had their own things that they were in tune with. And we each only have so much time, but, you know, we're in the information age now, and we get information every day, all day. And if you think about like George Floyd's murder, you know, if that wasn't caught on video, I mean, if that wasn't caught by an iPhone, or, you know, why has this suddenly become more of an issue? It's because it's a visual thing now. Philandro Castile and others, you know, it's been going on for years, but nobody actually saw video of it. I mean, so just keep that in mind as, you know, to emphasize, I guess, the point from Ian's group about the rise of social media. So with that, moving on here, I would still say that, you know, Ashoka interviewed all these influential social entrepreneurs, and, you know, they all pointed to three things for critical success and for success. And one was they needed legitimacy for their unreasonable models. You know, so if you take the idea of Alight, you know, or the former American Refugee Committee, I mean, you know, think of tackling that problem around the world. You know, how do you get legitimacy for that and scale it to a certain point? I mean, that's a big lift right there. So they need to have also access to networks of political, business, and media leaders. And I think, you know, the idea of business, of course, for good, and, you know, boards and councils and, you know, all these community leaders. I mean, it's really interesting. You know, you hear about people who get on Oprah, you know, and all of a sudden their things take off, or their book sales take off, or whatever it is. But you need access to those networks. And the third thing that keeps always coming up is capital. I mean, they need to have some money to be able to pull it off. And with that in mind, I mean, I want to think of it almost like an ecosystem, you know, and an ecosystem for social entrepreneurship is, you know, you need the social context. So there's a societal failure problem, you know, that's recognized by enough people to support it. Then there's that unreasonable social entrepreneur who's willing to tackle it, often who could be viewed as kind of crazy, or, you know, a dreamer or whatever, unrealistic. And then that capital infrastructure. So the idea that humanity, was that you, Yushi, who brought that up? I mean, that humanity as a whole is at a higher level of Maslow's hierarchy now. I think that's absolutely right. So, you know, there's that ecosystem there. So you've heard of ESG, and, you know, the trend towards social capitalism. And I think it's because as we've grown and become more interconnected, you know, we realize that business doesn't always account for everything. And so you think about environmental costs or environmental issues. You know, back in the days when the forests covered everything, and, you know, old growth pine trees or old growth trees were everywhere in the United States or North America, cutting down a couple hundred acres didn't mean anything. I mean, because you had plenty of them. And now today, you know, you think about the Weyerhausers of the world. I mean, they actually went through and, you know, cut them all down. So people weren't thinking about the environmental costs or the labor costs. You so exploitive labor, child labor. Look at women today. I mean, women still are not paid on the same, same job. They're not paid the same as men are. So, that's exploitive. And, look at the meatpacking plants, in Minnesota and Iowa, and we know what was exposed during the pandemic with COVID-19. So those labor issues are a big thing that came to the forefront, and they're still out there. And of course, racism, and more than police brutality, I mean, access to credit and redlining, and access to healthcare and education. I mean, there's a whole intertwined piece there. And so, I guess as we recognize and see these disequilibriums in the marketplace, because I would say each one of these is a disequilibrium here. It's not, everybody isn't treated the same or fairly, and it's how is the market going to come back and identify that. I saw in my lifetime the movement toward market-based philanthropy. I just wanted to touch on this briefly. I remember going to a talk by Jim Shannon, who was a Catholic archbishop, who got basically tossed out of the Catholic Church because he advocated birth control when the pill came out in 1962, and the Catholics kicked him out. So he went to become the president of the General Mills Foundation. And he gave a lecture saying, beware of market-based philanthropy, because he saw that happening at General Mills, where they were giving for food things, and where their philanthropy efforts are becoming really a part of their marketing efforts. And it used to be, companies would just give to like community chest, or they would give to other things. And market-based philanthropy has evolved and been justified as a way that, of continuing to maximize stakeholder value or shareholder value. And so there's also an argument in it that, companies would know more about the industry that they're in, food or financial products or whatever it is, which I'm not sure if that's true, but market-based philanthropy is out there and continues to be out there, but more so, this trend toward environmental, social, and government ESG investing, and you've all heard about that. And BlackRock, is now one of the biggest financial companies in the world, is using a different lens to evaluate companies to invest in. And we were just talking with Steve Spruth, who is a friend of ours who taught this class before with Matt and I. We took a walk with him yesterday, and he was saying that there's recent studies that ESG companies, or companies that are evaluated with ESG, are performing better in the stock market. I mean, try to say that investing in companies that stand for good is actually a wise investment strategy. And if you look at this middle paragraph here, and to Matt's point about timing, it's true that there will be no investment returns at all on a planet that's left uninhabitable by climate change or ravaged by civil war. I mean, or labor strife. But the time horizon, you in your lifetimes, if you think about it, if you're 22, 24 now, however old you are, you have 20, 30 years to kind of generate wealth for yourselves, and then you go off and retire or whatever you're going to do. Those time horizons, are still short. I mean, they're short in the context of climate change or labor, and they're, you think about a corporation's planning horizon, quarter by quarter, and back to those quarterly profits. I mean, clearly another element here in the, if you will, in the social entrepreneurship is timeline. Social entrepreneurs are in it for the long haul. I mean, they will devote 10, 20, 30, 40, 50 years toward equal rights for women or whatever it is. I mean, these are long haul things that don't fit those short-term capital models. So the element of time is a big question here. So I'll just close this by saying, that, as a, business is evolving, and it's been evolving for, 1,000 years or longer. And to think about it in that kind of context, I think is really useful. The pace of evolution has changed a lot just because of the pace of information. I mean, it's now happening. Things are changing in 10-year cycles rather than 1,000-year cycles. And, it's really an exciting time to be a part of it. And I just hope that all of you, in pursuing lives, if you do, as social entrepreneurs, I mean, can think of yourselves in this sort of historical context and realize that you're kind of on the forefront of the next wave, which is super exciting indeed. So I'm going to stop there, and Matt, you can take back the screen. And sorry if I talk too long. I mean, I'm excited about this. And if you have feedback, by the way, on the presentation, I'd love to hear it, because it's about how do you make it engaging for people. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Greg. I think it's really exciting to me to see where we've come from and where we're going towards. These are topics and conversations that we will continue to have. I also appreciate the fact that you're continuing to see them broadly, as we talked about, of how Carlson as an entity in our community is showing up. How are other institutions showing up? And you know, I think that's so important. Is awareness is the first step. Whether, you know, we talked about environmental issues, racism as it exists in, you know, individual, systemic, institutional level, and a number of other you know, issues that plague our communities. We are now, you know, global citizens where we have the awareness of, you know, commonalities or issues that plague us all. And so excited by the energy that's, you know, continuing to be put forth into these topics, and definitely something that needs our attention. We're going to take a quick break. We will come back at 11:10 and we'll close out the session from there.